France, 1429. The 100 Years' War has bled the land dry. Villages lie in ruins, kings plot in shadows, and hope is a dying ember in the hearts of the people. But in the darkest hour, a voice rises, a voice that claims to speak for God himself. A peasant girl, just 17 years old, steps onto the stage of history and changes it forever. Her name was Joan of Arc, a girl who heard divine voices, who led armies to victory, who crowned a king, and who, in the end, would face a fate so cruel her last words would echo through the centuries. This is her story. Joan was born in 1412, in a time when war was not just a king's affair, it was a plague that reached every home. The English and their Burgundian allies held vast swaths of France. The true king, Charles VII, was weak, uncrowned, and many believed illegitimate. But then, something miraculous happened. At just 13 years old, Joan began hearing voices. Saints, Michael, Catherine, Margaret, spoke to her in visions. They told her she had a sacred mission to save France. Imagine a peasant girl, uneducated, untested, walking into the court of a future king and declaring, "I am sent by God to drive out the English and see you crowned." They laughed at her, they tested her, but when she revealed secrets no peasant could know, the laughter stopped. By May 1429, Joan was leading French troops into battle. At Orléans, a city under siege for months, she did the impossible. Wounded by an arrow, she pulled it out herself and charged back into the fight. The English, who had mocked her as a witch in armor, now fled in terror. Victory followed victory. The French, demoralized for years, now fought like men possessed. And at Rheims, in a sacred ceremony, Joan stood beside Charles as he was finally crowned King of France. She had done it. The voices were right, but in the shadows, enemies were watching. And the higher Joan rose, the harder she would fall. Her greatest trials were yet to come. May 1430. The tide of war had turned, but Joan of Arc's fortune had not. Just 1 year after her greatest triumph, she found herself trapped, abandoned by the very king she had crowned. The Burgundians dragged her through the mud, sold her to the English, and locked her away. Now, the girl who had once led armies stood alone, facing an enemy no sword could defeat. This was no ordinary prisoner. This was a trial meant to break not just a woman, but a legend. The English did not want Joan dead, not yet. First, they needed her humiliated. If they could prove her a heretic, a fraud, then all her victories would be tainted. Charles VII's crown would lose its divine legitimacy, and so they handed her over to the church for an inquisition. The trial was a farce. The judges were handpicked by the English. The charges? Witchcraft, heresy, wearing men's clothing, a crime punishable by death. But Joan refused to bend. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Even her enemies were stunned. This was no frightened peasant girl. This was a woman who spoke like a prophet. For months, they interrogated her, twisted her words, threatened her with torture. They offered her freedom if she denied the voices. And then she broke. Just once. Worn down, terrified, Joan signed a confession. She agreed to wear women's clothes, to renounce her visions. The English cheered. They had won. But Joan's defiance was not so easily extinguished. Days later, she took back her confession. She knew what it meant. The law was clear. A relapsed heretic could be shown no mercy. And so, on May 30th, 1431, they led her to the stake. They gave her no last rites, no final comfort, only a paper crown, mocking her claim to divine guidance. As the flames licked higher, a voice cried out from the smoke. One last act of defiance. Joan, voiceover, trembling but clear. "Hold the cross high, so I may see it through the flames." Her last words were not of pain, nor of fear. They were of faith. But the story does not end here, for even in death, Joan of Arc would have the final victory. May 30th, 1431. As the smoke cleared, the executioners did something strange. They burned Joan's body twice more, reducing it to ashes, then cast what remained into the Seine. They feared even her bones might become relics. But some things cannot be so easily destroyed, because legends do not perish in fire. They take root in the hearts of those who witness them, and grow. At first, the English celebrated Joan was dead. The witch who had humiliated them was gone. But whispers spread through France. Whispers of a girl who had walked unflinching into the flames, who had called out for God until the very end. In secret, people prayed to her. Songs songs were sung, stories passed from village to village. The English had hoped her death would erase her. Instead, it made her immortal. And what of Charles VII, the king Joan had crowned? He said nothing, did nothing. For 20 years, he let her name linger in disgrace. But then, something changed. In 1450, with the war nearly won, Charles ordered an inquiry, not out of guilt, but because Joan's trial had tainted his own legitimacy. If she was a heretic, then so was his divine right to rule. Witnesses were summoned, testimony taken, and what they found was damning. The trial had been rigged from the start. The judges were bribed, the evidence forged. In 1456, the church declared Joan innocent, not just wrongfully executed, but martyred. The girl they had burned as a heretic was now a symbol of faith. And the English? Their greatest crime was no longer war, but this. Because history has a way of settling its accounts, and sometimes the defeated write the final chapter. But her story was never truly about kings, or wars, or even fire. It was about the last words she spoke and why they still echo today. History remembers many last words, kings and philosophers, poets and conquerors, all given their final moment of eloquence, but none burn themselves into memory quite like those of a 19-year-old girl standing alone in the smoke. What did Joan of Arc really say in her final moments? The records disagree. Some claim she screamed in agony, others insist she prayed silently, but one account persists, the words that would define her forever. 500 years later, a document was found in the archives of Paris, a long-lost letter from an English soldier who had been there that day. He wrote of how Joan had begged for a crucifix to be held before her, how she had called out not to the kings who failed her, but to the saints who had never left her side. Joan, voiceover, raw with emotion, but unwavering. Jesus, Jesus, that was all? No grand prophecy, no curse upon her enemies, just the name she had whispered since childhood in Domremy's fields. In 2006, forensic experts made a chilling discovery. Among charred bone fragments found near Rouen old marketplace was a piece of cloth, remarkably preserved. The weave matched 15th century peasant garb, and the scorch patterns? They suggested the wearer had been bound upright, unable to escape the flames. Science confirmed what the legends had always said. Joan did not die quickly. The executioners had used green wood to prolong the agony, yet every surviving account agrees she never recanted. Not truly. Centuries after her death, the church that had once condemned Joan would declare her a saint, not just for her victories, but for how she had died. In her last moments, she had given the world something rare, absolute conviction. That is why we remember. Not because she heard voices, not because she won battles, but because when the fire took her, she held fast to the truth as she knew it. Today, in the very fields where Joan first heard her voices, the earth still remembers. Tourists walk the ruins of Rouen's marketplace, searching for echoes in the cobblestones. And every year on May 30th, someone always leaves roses at the river's edge, because some fires never go out. If you've walked with us through these centuries, consider joining The Past Unfolded, where history's greatest voices are never silenced. Subscribe to keep their stories alive. Thank you.